Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do one last entry here for this go around. Then I'll give this series a brief rest, start focusing on another new series soon. Thank you everyone for your suggestions. This particular pick actually comes from, again, the website that I use that showcases a lot of the early old mysterious disappearances here in the U.S. In this case, something happening within the early 1900s. This one actually has to do with someone who was initially freed from slavery, rose to have several political positions later in office, and then met a mysterious fate. Apparently when he was going to jail, more on that here in a minute, later in his life, that's when he suddenly outright disappeared. No one seems to have any information associated with it. And in fact, there's allusions as far as it being tied to more nefarious purposes. And there's even one outlandish claim as to what truly happened to him. But more on that here in a minute. But it has to do with this. You're looking at a picture of him now. His name was Jeremiah Haralson. So let's go ahead and let's talk about his information here, his fascinating rise from slavery into those prominent positions, and I'll highlight the end of it by talking about his mysterious disappearance. So here's what happened. Jeremiah Haralson was born on April 1st, 1846, pretty much born into slavery right there at a plantation of a guy by the name of John Walker in Columbus, Georgia. This was that almost evil time period in America where there was outright slavery happening throughout the country. And in fact, for most of his young life, Jeremiah was essentially sold multiple times. He was sold on an auction block there in Columbus to a guy by the name of J.W. Thompson. And when that person died, he was later sold to a judge, a guy by the name of Jonathan Haralson, there in Selma, Alabama. And then what ended up happening was he was enslaved up until about 1865. And during this time period, he almost became like a self-taught person. In fact, while he was a slave, he ended up becoming a preacher to some of the other slaves there. And then after he was freed, after that time period from the Civil War, and there was this freedom that came for the slaves, that's when he was able to truly teach himself education. In fact, he was able to learn to read and write, and he used this time period to expand himself to not only become a farmer, but then also being involved in politics. In fact, he was one of the first 10 African-American congressmen ever elected in the United States. So how about that when it comes to this guy Jeremiah Haralson having such a huge feat when it comes to being freed from slavery and then being involved in politics. In fact, starting outright in 1868, just 3 years after he was essentially freed, that's when he was in turn campaigning for various offices, and then that's when he in turn was a candidate for U.S. Congress in 1968. Lots of information is missing from some of this, including the fact about the votes associated with it, but eventually going into 1870, he was campaigning for the Republican Party, and then also he was elected as the first African American of the Alabama House of Representatives, also in 1870. And then moving on up to 1872, he was elected to the state Senate, and he helped also get a civil rights bill through the Senate, and this was in turn giving him more power, more political stance when it came to his position. And then cut to 1874, and he was part of Alabama's first congressional district. And then finally, like going to other places, like he was eventually, by about 1879, appointed by President Rutherford B. Hayes to an official federal patronage position within the United States Custom House. And in fact, he was also part of their pension bureau, and he worked for the Department of the Interior. And then it was at this point, cut to a little bit after that, where he moved to Louisiana, and then officially serving as a pension agent for that department too in the pension bureau. So again, it goes to show how this man self-taught himself after being freed from slavery, rose to become a prominent member, a political member, one of the first 10 African Americans to do so, and then ended up being appointed by president, no less, within a department, a pension bureau in this case, of the United States. And it was at this point, I don't have much information on it, but at this point where he apparently took a turn, like in other words, a wrongful term. And this was of the fact that he was indicted and convicted of charges of pension fraud. This was in 1895. And then it was at this point that he was going to be sent to the Albany County Penitentiary there in Albany, New York. Here's where things though take a mysterious turn. As he was apparently going into that penitentiary, who knows if this involved the day of or maybe even before it, but as he was going into that penitentiary, all of a sudden records of him, historical records of even going into it, were gone. Like in other words, he was no longer there. There was no records of him going to that penitentiary, staying into the penitentiary, escaping, being transferred maybe to another prison, anything like that. I couldn't even find much info as to the actual charges into the pension fraud and what he may have done and so on. So all of this just remains up in the air, very mysterious. Now, when it comes to his disappearance, here you have someone that for a good part of like 20, 30 years or so was doing so much political work, and then all of a sudden he would be indicted on this stuff in terms of these charges, these fraud charges, and then go to to the penitentiary to serve his record and then be gone. There would be no record of him entering it, going anywhere else. Nothing. That's why it remains so mysterious to this day. His date of death, in fact, remains a question mark. It's been presumed that it's sometime in 1916. I'm guessing that's when either A, he was legally declared dead, or some other evidence somewhere seems to point to him essentially being gone by that point. In fact, this is what leads to the next outlandish claim. Apparently, within the biographical directory of the United States Congress, it states that after that time period, he ended up moving to Texas, then Oklahoma, and then Colorado, where now, instead of being a political person, he worked as a coal miner. And then out of the blue, he ended up being killed by wild animals while he was hunting in Denver in 1916. You see how it's very outlandish, like when it comes to what I was stating earlier? I mean, here you have a situation where somebody who spent 20 to 30 something years in politics is now suddenly working as a coal miner. Not only that, but moving between three different states at least, and then ending up going on a hunt, being killed by wild animals with no corroborating evidence of any kind whatsoever. Strange stuff, right, when it comes to this type of mysteriousness. But nobody has ever really been able to take a deeper look to see what happened to Jeremiah Haralson. But otherwise, as far as him being charged with that fraud and then being sent to prison, him at that point mysteriously disappearing, that just seems to be what happened at the end of his life. No answers, no concrete answers, and that's pretty much it. Hopefully there'll be something in terms of some evidence sometime in the future that'll be uncovered, and then this evidence will help create some final resolution as to what occurred with Jeremiah Haralson. But up to this point, everything that he accomplished, especially when it comes to rising from such a horrible place in his life, being a slave and then becoming a powerful political person, to something like this happening, is just something, again, that's just so mysterious, so frustratingly mysterious. But if anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about those of you that happen to be from the area there that he ended up going to, the penitentiary there in Albany, New York? If you have some more local information there, stuff that might have been passed down over who knows how many generations, it'd be great to hear what your comments are below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.